If you had asked me 2 years ago what I thought about religion, I would have laughed. I was the kind of person who thought I had life figured out. Grew up middle class, educated, successful in my own way. I wasn't rude about people's beliefs, I just thought they were a crutch. God, miracles, heaven, nice stories to help people sleep at night. But not real, definitely not scientific. I used to say, if God really wanted to get my attention, he'd have to show up in person. I thought I was too smart for faith, too logical for Jesus, too modern for miracles. I built my identity around that skepticism. I read the philosophers, followed the science, listened to all the popular voices telling me that belief was weakness and doubt was power. And maybe it was, for a time. It gave me a sense of control. But deep down, if I'm honest, there was always this quiet ache like something was missing. I filled it with work, travel, relationships, distractions, anything but stillness. Because stillness made the silence too loud. And in that silence, I think something holy had been trying to whisper for years, but I wouldn't listen. That all changed one ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was leading a strategy call for my team, mid-sentence, when the world suddenly tilted. A sharp, unforgiving pain exploded in my chest, not like anxiety or stress, but like something tearing open from the inside. My vision dimmed, sound turned to static, and I collapsed right there at my desk. My heart stopped. Just like that, I was gone, clinically dead for 6 minutes. 6 minutes, they told me later. But where I went, it felt like eternity. I didn't float above my body. There were no tunnels or lights at first, just darkness. Heavy, pressing, suffocating darkness. Until, in the distance, a faint glow appeared, not white, not golden, but alive. It pulsed like a heartbeat, and from that light, a figure emerged. He didn't need introduction. My soul knew before my mind did. It was him, Jesus. Not the cartoon version from books or the stained glass windows. He was real, radiant, fierce and gentle at once. And his eyes didn't just look at me, they looked through me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I dropped to my knees, and in that moment, I felt the full weight of my life. Not just the sins, but the dismissals, the pride, the excuses. He didn't yell, he didn't condemn, he just looked at me with this holy sorrow. And then I heard him say, not out loud, but directly into my soul, I sent you 7 signs, and you ignored all of them. I wanted to scream. What signs? I wanted to beg for a second chance. I wanted to tell him I didn't know. But the truth was, I did. I knew. Somewhere deep down, I had always known. And then, he raised his hand, and the first memory unfolded before us like a film on fire. The moment Jesus lifted his hand, the space around us rippled like liquid light. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't like watching a memory. It was like reliving it, as if time folded in on itself and pulled me back into the most forgotten corner of my soul. I stood in my old bedroom, the one I had at age 10. I could see myself, so small, sitting on the carpet with my arms crossed in defiance while my grandmother tried to pray over me. She was in the final stages of cancer. Her body was frail, but her spirit, unshaken. That night, she had asked me to join her in prayer. Just one, Our Father, she said. That's all. I rolled my eyes and muttered something like, God doesn't care. Grandma. I remember she didn't get angry. She just smiled gently, reached for my hand and whispered, even when you don't care, he does. Then she closed her eyes and prayed out loud. And for the first time, I felt something I couldn't explain. A strange stillness, a warmth, like the entire room had shifted into a sacred hush. I told myself later that it was just the emotion of the moment. But standing here now, next to Jesus, I knew better. She was my servant, Jesus said softly, still gazing into the scene. I was there in that room, That stillness you felt, that was me. That was your first sign. I couldn't breathe. My knees buckled under the weight of the truth. How many years had I mocked people for believing? How many years had I told myself that everything spiritual was either coincidence or delusion? But now I saw that moment for what it really was, not just a memory, but a divine invitation, and I had slammed the door shut. Tears streamed down my face. I didn't know, I tried to say. I didn't understand. But my excuses sounded hollow even to me, because somewhere in that tiny 10-year-old heart, I had felt something and I'd buried it. The vision faded, and we were back in that ethereal space. I could feel my soul straining under the pressure of regret. I wanted to go back. I wanted to relive it, to get on my knees with my grandmother and mean it this time. But time, that cruel thief, doesn't move backwards. Not there. Jesus didn't condemn me. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just looked at me with eyes so full of mercy it broke me even more. Then he said, "I sent another sign when your logic tried to replace your longing." Before I could ask what he meant, the light shifted again. The second memory had already begun to unfold, and I was not ready for what I was about to relive next. The light around us swirled again, and suddenly I was no longer beside Jesus. I was in a college lecture hall, seated in the third row, notebook open, mind alert but heart detached. I was studying philosophy back then, full of ideas and pride, memorizing Nietzsche and Dawkins quotes like they were sacred scripture. I remembered that day clearly now. It was the first time I raised my hand to publicly challenge the existence of God. Not because I was curious, but because I wanted to win. I wanted to feel superior to anyone who believed. I had stood up in front of the class and said, "If there's a God, he can come right now and prove himself. If not, he doesn't exist. Simple as that." The room laughed, even the professor smirked. I felt powerful, untouchable, but I hadn't noticed the girl in the back, the quiet one with the silver cross around her neck until now. She had raised her hand and said calmly, "Just because you don't hear a song doesn't mean the radio isn't playing. Maybe the problem isn't God's silence. Maybe it's your frequency." At the time, I scoffed. But now, rewatching it, I saw something else, the way the air shimmered subtly around her, as if heaven had leaned in closer during that moment. Jesus stood beside me again and said, "That was the second sign. I sent you a voice in the middle of your pride. You heard truth, but chose applause instead." I covered my face with my hands. How had I missed it? How had I been so blind? She had spoken with grace and truth, and I had buried it under sarcasm and ego. I had been given a lifeline, but I mocked the very hand that offered it. The vision shifted, a flash forward. A different scene now, me, in my dorm room, alone one night, scrolling through meaningless posts. I had paused on a video someone shared, a testimony of a man who had died and met Jesus. I remembered watching it halfway, then slamming my laptop shut. "What garbage," I muttered to myself. But I also remembered how unsettled I felt. I couldn't sleep that night. My chest was tight, my dreams were chaotic, and yet I never connected the dots. I assumed it was stress. Now, standing beside Jesus, I realized it had been conviction, a soul being stirred. "You asked for logic," Jesus said, his voice soft but unshakable. "I gave you truth wrapped in humility, but pride speaks louder than peace when the heart is closed." I fell to my knees again, not because he made me, but because the truth did. My whole life had been full of excuses. I thought I had rejected religion because it didn't make sense. But what I was really rejecting was surrender. I didn't want to bend. I didn't want to need. And now, looking into the face of the very one I had mocked, I couldn't deny it anymore. He had been chasing me, again and again, through people, through moments, through whispers in the night, and I ignored them all. Then Jesus stepped forward, and as I looked up at him with eyes swollen from weeping, he said something I will never forget. "The third sign came when you broke, and instead of running to me, you ran to noise." I didn't know what he meant yet, But the next memory was already rising, and it was going to hurt. When Jesus mentioned that third sign, my heart shuddered even before the vision formed. I knew exactly where we were headed. The space around us spun gently, colors blurring until they sharpened again, and I found myself reliving one of the most painful nights of my life. I was standing in my old apartment, staring blankly at the dark screen of my phone. My father had just passed away suddenly from a stroke. It was a loss that shattered my heart and rattled everything I thought I knew. I remember the numbness, the suffocating emptiness. Yet, instead of turning inward, instead of leaning into the quiet grief that might have brought healing, I reached desperately for distraction, anything to fill the silence. That night, instead of seeking peace, I chose noise. I went to a crowded bar, drank until the world spun around me, laughed louder than I felt, and drowned every whisper of pain. But now, as I relived that moment, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Amid the music, the chatter, the forced laughter, there was a woman in the corner of the bar. I'd never noticed her until now. Yet in the clarity of this spiritual moment, I saw her distinctly. She sat quietly, her eyes fixed sadly on me, and around her neck was a tiny cross, glittering gently in the bar's harsh light. Jesus was suddenly beside me again, his voice soft but deeply penetrating. That night, your heart cried out for comfort. I was there. I placed a messenger right before you, someone who could have guided you toward peace, but you chose the noise. That was your third sign. The truth hit me like a tidal wave, overwhelming and undeniable. He had reached for me even in my darkest moment, but I refused to see it. I refused to listen. The ache I felt in his presence was deeper than the loss itself, because it wasn't just grief now, it was regret. How different my life might have been had I simply paused, quieted myself, and listened. Tears flowed freely down my cheeks. I wanted desperately to undo the choices I'd made, to run back and embrace the pain rather than fleeing it. But again, time moved only forward, not backward, and all I could do now was acknowledge how wrong I'd been. The vision faded, and we returned to that luminous, sacred space. Jesus didn't rebuke me. He didn't need to. His very presence exposed every hidden corner of my soul, every quiet denial I'd carried. He gently spoke again, each word a loving but firm revelation. The fourth sign was quieter, a whisper, intended to draw you back home, but you chose bitterness instead. I raised my eyes, frightened by what he would show me next. Yet I knew I had no choice but to witness each moment, no matter how painful, because every step brought clarity to my stubborn, wandering heart. The space shifted again, and the next memory unfolded with gentle inevitability, and I knew that once again, I would have to face the truth I had spent a lifetime denying. The scene shifted again, as though I were a silent witness to a private moment I'd long forgotten or, rather, refused to remember. I found myself in a dimly lit room, sitting alone with a book I hadn't opened in years. It was a journal I kept in my early 20s, filled with bitter entries and angry questions aimed at God, though I didn't admit it then. The pages were stained with tears and scribbles that betrayed my frustration and confusion. In that moment, I remembered nights spent wrestling with doubt, aching for answers but refusing to soften my heart. Every unanswered prayer felt like a slap, every hardship a punishment. I had grown cold, hardened by disappointment and pride. Bitterness had crept in like a shadow, blinding me to the whispers of grace all around. Suddenly, Jesus appeared beside me, calm yet piercing. "You heard the quiet calls," he said softly, "the prayers unspoken and the moments of stillness. I sent you gentle nudges to turn toward me, but you chose walls instead. That bitterness was your fourth sign." I felt shame wash over me in waves. How had I mistaken silence for absence? How had I allowed pain to build a fortress between myself and the love I so desperately needed? I realized then that my anger was really just fear. Fear of surrender, fear of vulnerability, fear of being truly known. Tears blurred my vision as I begged silently for forgiveness. The weight of years crushed me, but within that crushing, I sensed a tender mercy that made me want to change to begin again, if only I was given the chance. Jesus nodded gently, as if he understood the struggle better than I ever could. "There are still 3 signs left," he said, "and they are harder to face. Are you ready?" I swallowed hard. I didn't want to be ready, but I had no choice. The truth was here, raw and undeniable, and it demanded to be faced. The space around us pulsed softly, and the next memory began to take shape, one that would test every bit of my courage. The next memory unfolded slowly, drawing me into a scene from a time I'd rather forget. I was standing at a crossroads, but not a physical one, a spiritual one. I was overwhelmed by choices, between truth and convenience, between love and bitterness, between surrender and stubborn independence. I saw myself in a conversation with a close friend, someone who cared deeply about me, someone who tried to share wisdom and faith without judgment. But instead of listening, I pushed them away. I argued, dismissed their words as naive, even mocked their beliefs. I chose the easier path of isolation, the familiar echo chamber of my own doubts. Jesus was beside me again, his presence a calm anchor in the storm. "That was the 5th sign," he said quietly. "I sent you messengers in flesh and blood, those who cared enough to show you the way. But you closed your heart and ears. You chose loneliness over love." I felt the sting of that truth like a fresh wound. How many hands had reached out to me? How many voices had whispered encouragement and hope only to be met with silence or scorn? I remembered a particular moment, a phone call late at night from a friend who had seen my pain and simply wanted to pray with me. I had hung up instead. I had shut the door to healing because I thought I could carry the burden alone. The weight of regret was crushing. I wished I could rewind, tear down the walls I built, and accept the love that was freely offered. But there was no going back, only this moment, only the chance to face the truth and change going forward. Jesus looked at me with infinite patience. "The 6th sign," he said, "was in your dreams, visions you dismissed as mere imagination." Before I could ask more, the scene shifted again, and the next memory began to bloom, like fragile light breaking through a storm. The light dimmed and shifted, and suddenly I was inside a dream. Or maybe it was more than that. It was a place of hazy shadows and whispered truths. I saw myself asleep in my bed, restless and troubled. In this dream, a figure appeared, not fully formed, but radiant. It reached out a hand toward me, beckoning me to follow. The presence was both gentle and urgent. At the time, I'd brushed it off as just a dream, a trick of the mind fueled by stress and exhaustion. I told myself it meant nothing, but now, seeing it again in this sacred space, I realized it had been a sign, a calling, a message from the divine. Jesus stood beside me, his voice soft but clear. "I sent you dreams to pierce the veil of your doubt, to speak when words could not, but you dismissed them as mere fantasy. That was your 6th sign." I felt a deep ache of sorrow and frustration. How many times had I ignored that subtle stirring in my soul? How often had I silenced the whisper of hope, the pull toward something greater? I had built walls so high that even my own dreams could not reach me. The dream faded, and we were back together in the light, but the weight of what remained was heavier still. Only one sign left, the final, most painful one. Jesus looked at me with a mixture of love and sadness. "The 7th sign," he said, "was in the silence when you could have chosen me, but chose to turn away." I swallowed hard, knowing what this meant. The moment came into focus like a cruel mirror held up to my face. The space around us was still, heavy with expectation. As the last memory unfolded, I was thrown into the most devastating moment of all the silence before the fall. I saw myself in a church pew, surrounded by familiar faces, yet utterly alone. The choir sang, the prayers echoed, but I felt nothing. No warmth, no peace, no connection. just a cold emptiness. This was the moment when I had the choice, the moment I could have reached out, lowered my defenses, and embraced the love that was patiently waiting for me. But instead, I looked away. I chose the safety of my doubts, the comfort of my pride, and I turned my back on him. Jesus' voice broke through the silence, soft but firm, like a whisper carrying the weight of eternity. In the silence, I was waiting. I sent you 7 signs in love, in hope, in mercy, and you ignored them all. But even now, I am here, waiting. I collapsed to my knees, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of mercy I'd been shown and the years I'd wasted. The pain of regret was nothing compared to the flood of grace pouring over me now. I wanted to beg for forgiveness, to start over, to be made new. Jesus knelt beside me and placed his hand gently on my shoulder. "This is not the end," he said. "There is still time. Your story is not finished." In that moment, I felt a warmth that healed every wound, lifted every burden, and filled the hollow places inside me. I knew then that he had never stopped chasing me, never stopped loving me even when I refused to see the signs. As my consciousness began to return to my body, I carried that love with me, a fire ignited deep within, a promise of new beginnings.